Hi guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial on creating an ASP.NET Core application with Angular 7. And in the last video tutorial, we learned how we could create a modal pop-up and implement it in our application. In this video tutorial, we would be coding our registration method. So our register component.ts requires us to call the web API method. So whenever a user registers in our application, he's obviously going to click the submit button. So our application is loading. So when the user has finished filling out this form in the registration component and he hits submit, then we have to make sure that this call goes to the web API to verify the user's details and make sure that we get an appropriate response. Response can be an error response. Response can be that the user has successfully registered in our application, but we will definitely get a response. Now, to call that API method, as we all know, if who are watching this video tutorial series, that we have already created an account service class that is going to handle all the account related web API calls. This service is dependable for anything that is related to the account web API or our account controller. We have a login method, we have a logout method, and here we will also have our registration method. So I've created a method and called it register. Now inside this registration method, we need to write the logic or the code that will go and call the register API or the registration API which we have created in the account controller. And when we are calling the register method in the account controller, the register action method, we need to provide some data, which is the form data, which is coming from the body of our application. So let's go back. And now here we have to add some values that will be passed to that method. So now let's go ahead and code this register method. So here inside the registration or the register method, we need to create some variables or some objects that will hold the values of our form controls. So one is the username, second password, and third is the email. Now please note I have not added any option for confirm password. That's because here we want to make sure that the user knows that what password he's entering. Therefore we have created a value or a field here. But if you want to again validate the values are same, you can write some logic here where you'll put a condition saying confirm password and password matches. But we are not going to do that because we already have created a custom validator in the component itself that is going to verify if these values are same. And when we will see this when we will start working on the HTML content, that how these errors will be displayed using validators. But for now I don't have any value for confirm password and I don't need it or we don't need it in this method. So now let's go ahead and write our method. What do we want to do here in the register method is to return a response, correct? So same thing we did in an login method, we returned a response, a result. So same thing we will do here. So we will return a HTTP response. Therefore, we are going to call our HTTP object that we instantiated in the constructor. Please remember that it's in the constructor. And then we will call the post method. And now the post method, the type of result will be any. And now here inside this method, we want to write or pass the URL that needs to be called for this registration method. And the URL to call our register API, we will create an object for that, a variable that will hold the value. So let's call this base URL register. and it's a string, and the value will be initialized to API account / register. As we all know that when we are calling the controller method, we have to call API / the controller name, which is account, and the action method name. So that's what we are doing here. Next thing, we want to add this object here, which is the base URL, because first parameter is to pass the URL that we need to call. So base URL register, comma. Now second parameter will be all the values that we want to pass, the data that we want to pass to that method. So two curly braces here, which will hold all the values. So let's add all the values that we want to pass. So I have added the values for username, password, and email, which will be passed by the parameter of our method. Next thing that we want to do is here we want to call the pipe method. And if you have watched the login video tutorial, I have clearly explained why we need pipe method. So just to keep it short, we need pipe method because pipe method helps us to call multiple methods inside it, and all methods will be called in a sequence. So now let's call the pipe method in this post method call. So we'll say dot pipe, and inside the pipe method, what we want to do is we want to call the map method. So let's call the map method, and the map method will help us to manipulate the data or the result that we get from our HTTP post method call. So we will receive a result. The result, as I said earlier, can be an error result, error response, or can be the data, a success response with the result data. So to manipulate that data or to access that data or to do something with that data, we will first call the map method. And now inside the map method, first thing we want to do, the result that we receive, we will call a lambda expression on that. And here inside the lambda expression, what we want to do is if the registration is success, if the response, if the result is a success. So let me just put a comment here, registration was successful. So when registration was successful, we want to redirect the user to login. So we want to first return the result, then redirect to login. But our account service is not responsible for redirecting a user to a specific component, to a specific page or a view. Account service is only responsible to accept a request and then provide a response in the form of a result. The response, as I told you earlier, can be an error response, can be a success response. Therefore, the responsibility to redirect the user will depend on the individual component, in this case, the register component, which will take the response. And if the response is success, then it will redirect the user to the login component. Whereas here in the account service, the logout method, we did redirect the user to the login page. That's because we don't have an individual logout component. Therefore, when the button is clicked, we redirect the user to the login page. So once again, if we have an account service is only going to return response, not going to redirect the user to any component or a page. Next thing in this register method is if there was an error, we want to return that error. So let's write some code for that. Now, once again, we are going to use lambda expression. We'll add here, and then here we are going to say if there is an error, we will return that error. So the error here can be of different types, can be that the user already exists because he's using the same username to register, or if the email is already registered, we need a unique email. So there can be different types of errors. So we will return that error, and then when we receive any error response, what we want to do is in our application, we will display it on the model that we created in the previous video tutorial. So that should be it for the register method or the register method in our account service. Next step is to go back to our register component.ts and then use this register method inside our onSubmit method, which will be called when the submit button is clicked on the registration form. So let's go ahead and create a variable. So let's call this variable as user details, and we will use a local variable, or because the scope of this variable will only be within this uh, code block which is on submit method. So we will use the let keyword, and using that we will create our variable or an object that will hold the user details. And the user details will be once again coming from the form, and our form object can be accessed by the name insert form, which is a part of form group, and we have clearly instantiated or initialized these insert form and the form controls inside that in our ng-onIt method. So let's go ahead and call the insert form object, and then to get all the values of the form controls, we will use the value property, and now all the values will be stored in this local variable which is user details. Next thing that we want to do here is call the register method which we just created inside the account service using the account service object which is instantiated here in the constructor. So let's do that. And let's call the register method, and now here inside the register method we want to pass the values, because our register method here in the account service requires us to pass the value of username, password, and email. So let's do that. So all these values are stored inside this object here, user details. So let's call our user details object, and then dot username comma user details dot password and user details dot email. So our insert form value is already initialized with these properties. So make sure that you spell them correct when you are calling them using their property names. Now we will subscribe the result that we receive from our register method. So we know that our register method is going to return a response, and we are going to first subscribe to that response. And inside here, we are going to use the lambda expression once again to manipulate the response. So we receive a result, and now let's go ahead and write the logic to handle this response. So first thing here, to handle the response, I'm going to create an object here, and it's going to be called as invalid register. If the invalid register if the response is a success, we need to set this to true, and if the response is a failure, then we are going to set it to false. So let's call invalid register, and we will set this to true, the first thing that we want to do from the result. Then we will route the user. So we have our router object that is instantiated in the constructor. Using that router object, we will navigate the user to our login view or the login component. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not the responsibility of the service to navigate the user to the login view. It's the component's responsibility. So the component will then navigate the user if the result was a success. So now we are also going to send the error result if the result was an error. So to handle that error, we will use the error lambda expression here, because we are returning a result and we are returning an error in the register method call. So if the response received was error, then we want to display that error inside a modal pop-up. So what we want to first do is, first we will store all the errors that we received inside an array. So let's go ahead and create an array in our properties. So let's create an array, call it error list, and it will be of type string. It's a string array that will contain all the errors. Let's also initialize this string array here in our ng-onIt method. So when a component is instantiated, or it's when we are landing on the component view, first thing that we want to do is initialize all properties. So we will set the error list to an empty array. If there are any errors already existing from the previous call, then it is going to change it and going to make it an empty array. So we'll make sure we don't show the old errors. So now we have an empty array, we have initialized this. So if there is an error in the response call, then we will fill that array with all the errors that we received. So what we want to do here is set the invalid register to false. Actually, we don't even need this invalid register object here. So let's get rid of this to avoid any confusion. So since we are going to display the errors inside a modal pop-up, we don't need to have this invalid register object here. We could just display, if there's an error, we will display it in the modal. So if you want to test if there is an error, you can always create a variable called as invalid register, and you can console.log it to check if the registration was successful or no. But for now, I don't think you need the invalid register object, so I have got rid of it. And all I'm going to do for now in this video tutorial is console.log the errors if there are any errors. And in the next video tutorial, we will work on the register component.html and then test this registration method. And if everything works fine, then we will go ahead and display the errors in the modal pop-up. So for now, just comment this modal ref object here so that it doesn't pop up when you click the submit method. And we will end this video tutorial here. Please like and subscribe my channel Tech Howdy, and don't forget to watch the previous video tutorials in order to understand how these components were created. Thank you once again.